The cafe was alive with morning chaos. Clinking cups, steaming espresso, laughter that didn't belong to him. He stood there, tray in hand, eyes tired but steady. Then it happened, a single, deliberate tilt of his wrist, and the hot coffee splashed across the pristine white suit of the CEO sitting at table 3. Gasp filled the room. Every head turned. The world froze for a heartbeat. His manager's eyes widened in horror, already calculating the damage, the firing, the fallout. But the man didn't flinch. He simply whispered, "I'm sorry," his voice trembling not from fear, but from something deeper, something unresolved. The CEO looked up, furious at first, but then something about his face stopped her. It was as if she'd seen that look before, pain wrapped in calm. She didn't know it yet, but this accident was no accident at all. It was destiny knocking. He didn't sleep much that night before the spill. Maybe 2 hours, maybe less. The kind of rest where your body collapses, but your mind keeps running, chasing unpaid bills, forgotten dreams, and a small voice calling out, "Papa, don't be late." That voice was the only thing that could silence the noise in his head. Her name was Maya, 6 years old, the light of a life that had known too much darkness already. Every morning began before dawn. He'd stand by her bedside, brushing his fingers through her messy hair, whispering, "I'll be back before you wake up." But she always woke anyway, just to catch him leaving. She'd wave her tiny hand, eyes still half asleep, and he'd force a smile that looked stronger than it felt. Then he'd step out into the cold, empty streets. Another day pretending to be fine. The restaurant was his battlefield. Polished floors, bright lights, customers who smiled without looking, talking about vacations he could never afford. He'd mastered the art of invisibility, serving, smiling, apologizing. Every "yes, sir," and, of course, "ma'am," was another coin in the jar, another meal for Mia, another rent payment avoided by a few days of luck. But deep down, he was tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix. The kind that settled into your bones when life kept asking for more than you had to give. His coworkers liked him. They said he was quiet, humble, good with customers. No one knew his story. He never talked about his past or the photo in his wallet, the one of a woman with gentle eyes and a smile that could stop time. Her name was Clara, his wife. His once upon a time. Clara had been sick, a disease that ate away at her strength and his hope. He'd begged every hospital, every insurance office, every person with a suit and clipboard for help. But money spoke louder than desperation. He remembered sitting in a CEO's office once. Polished marble floors, air, conditioned chill that made his skin crawl. He remembered the woman behind the desk. The same woman he spilled coffee on that morning. She didn't remember him, of course. To her, he was just another man with a folder of documents, eyes red from sleepless nights. She'd skimmed his papers, sighed, and said, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do." Those words had broken him quietly. Not in anger, but in the realization that the world doesn't pause for someone's pain. He'd left that building with a heart half empty and a wife half alive. A month later, Clara was gone. After that, he became two people, the man who smiled at tables and the man who broke down in the dark. Every time he looked at Mia, he saw both love and a promise that she would never feel that kind of loss again. He'd work any job, take any insult, wear any mask, just to keep her safe, to keep the world from touching her the way it touched him. But pain doesn't disappear, it hides. It waits in quiet corners until life forces you to look it in the eye again. And that's what happened the day she walked in. The CEO. Her presence filled the cafe like a storm in a clear sky. The same face he'd once begged mercy from. Perfectly composed, untouchable, powerful. He recognized her instantly. She didn't recognize him at all, and that hurt more than he expected. How could someone forget a moment that defined your entire life? How could she sip her coffee so calmly, not knowing she'd once turned her back on a dying woman and a desperate man. As he stood there watching her, something inside him cracked. It wasn't hatred. He'd outgrown that. It was something else. A longing for acknowledgement, for humanity, for her to see him, truly see him, even for a second. The cafe was busy, orders flying, machines hissing. But his mind was far away, back to hospital corridors, to holding Clara's hand, to watching her fade while the bills piled up. He remembered her last words. "Don't let the world harden you, love. Promise me you'll stay kind." He'd promised. But that promise was becoming heavier every day. When he saw the CEO look up from her laptop, impatience in her eyes, something inside him whispered, now, not to hurt, not to humiliate, but to awaken. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was madness. But it was honest. He picked up the tray, walked toward her, and in that slow, deliberate movement, his past collided with his present. The coffee spilled, dark, bitter, staining the white fabric like truth seeping through denial. For a heartbeat, the world froze. And in that silence, he felt something strange, not regret, but release. For once, the power dynamic was reversed. Not out of revenge, but out of courage. He had dared to be seen. As she stared at him, eyes wide, he met her gaze. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet sorrow. The kind that says, "You may not remember me, but I remember you." It was a conversation without words, the kind that travels deeper than sound. When he whispered, "I'm sorry," it wasn't just for the spill. It was for everything. For the broken promises, for the years lost, for the kindness the world had forgotten. The apology was a bridge between two lives that had once collided and gone separate ways. He walked back to the counter, heart pounding but strangely light. Around him, the murmurs of customers filled the air again. The manager's footsteps approached, panic written all over his face. But for once, the waiter wasn't afraid. Something sacred had already shifted. The moment had meaning. And as the CEO sat there, dabbing her suit with a napkin, her mind began to whirl. She couldn't explain it, but something about his face wouldn't leave her alone. It was as if the universe had replayed an old scene, one she'd forgotten, but he never could. She didn't know it yet, but that spilled coffee was more than an accident. It was a message, years in the making, written in silence, delivered in a single trembling hand. And as he wiped the counter, he thought of Clara, of her smile, and of the words that guided him still. Stay kind, no matter what. That morning, kindness didn't look like silence. It looked like courage. And courage, for the first time in years, felt like peace. The CEO sat still for a moment longer than she should have. The cafe noise returned. Clinking spoons, chatter, the soft hum of background music. But none of it reached her. Her mind was somewhere else, caught in the space between confusion and memory. She looked down at her suit, the dark stain spreading across the crisp, white fabric, but the real discomfort wasn't on her skin. It was somewhere deeper. It was the look in his eyes, the quiet pain, the kind that carried history. She told herself to shake it off. "It's just coffee," she muttered under her breath, reaching for a napkin. But her hand trembled. Not because of the spill, but because of something she couldn't name. It had been years since anything, or anyone, had unsettled her like that. She had built her life on control, precision, and the luxury of never being caught off guard. Yet a simple waiter had done just that, without a word. Her name was Evelyn Shaw, 42 years old, CEO of one of the country's largest health corporations, the kind of woman newspapers described as formidable, visionary, fearless. She had earned every one of those titles, and yet they all felt hollow now, because beneath the surface of her perfectly composed life lay a truth she had buried, one that the stranger's eyes had just unearthed. Evelyn hadn't always been this way. Once she had dreams, too. Not of power, but a purpose. She'd gone into healthcare to help people, to make a difference. But somewhere between board meetings, quarterly targets, and the quiet poison of ambition, she had changed. The heart that once wanted to heal learned to calculate. The compassion that used to define her became a liability she could no longer afford. She had become efficient, ruthless, and successful. She wore her achievements like armor. Custom, tailored suits, diamond watches, luxury cars. They told the world she was unshakable. But that armor had a cost. It silenced the small, fragile voice inside her that used to whisper, "Remember why you started." As she sat there dabbing her suit, she couldn't stop thinking about the waiter's eyes. There was something haunting about them. Not anger, not fear, but sorrow that demanded to be seen. It reminded her of someone. But who? She tried to recall. Her mind flipped through years of meetings, applications, faces. Too many faces. Too many pleas for help she had denied without a second thought. And then, like a flash, a memory hit her. Faint but sharp. A man in a small, dimly lit office years ago. He had stood across from her desk, holding a folder close to his chest. His voice had been trembling when he said, "Please, my wife needs the treatment. I can't afford the premium plan, but there must be something you can do." She remembered the meeting now. She had been younger then, still learning the language of corporate cruelty. Her supervisor's words echoed in her mind, "Don't let emotions cloud your judgment, Shaw. Numbers don't lie." So, she had smiled politely and said, "I'm sorry, sir. Our hands are tied." He had nodded quietly, like a man who'd already expected disappointment. But his eyes, those same eyes, had stayed with her for days, until work piled up, meetings multiplied, and her conscience drowned beneath success. And now he was here, older, worn, dressed in a waiter's uniform instead of a factory one, but unmistakable. The same quiet eyes, the same unspoken pain. Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. Not guilt exactly, but an ache. An echo of the person she once was. She watched him from a distance as he continued his work, calm, polite, pretending as though nothing had happened. The manager scolded him softly, but he just nodded, taking the blame without complaint. There was dignity in him, even now, and that unsettled her more than any accusation could. She tried to return to her laptop, to drown herself in emails and schedules, but the words blurred. Instead, she found herself watching him move. The way he refilled cups, smiled at strangers, and carried the weight of invisible worlds on his shoulders. She recognized that kind of silence. It was the silence of people who had lost everything and learned to keep going anyway. For the first time in years, she felt small, not because he had embarrassed her, but because she saw herself reflected in the worst way, as someone who had once held the power to help and chose not to. Her phone buzzed on the table. Another meeting reminder. Another deal waiting to be closed. But she didn't move. For the first time, her carefully built world felt meaningless. What was the point of all this success if she couldn't remember the faces of the people she'd failed? She caught herself whispering his words in her mind, "I'm sorry." But his sorry had meant something entirely different. His came from pain. Hers, from realization. When he walked past her table again, their eyes met briefly. This time, she didn't look away. He didn't either. For a second, it felt as if time had folded back, the past and present merging into one silent confrontation. Evelyn felt a sting behind her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. She didn't even remember how. Power had made her strong, but strength had made her cold. And now, with one look, this man had cracked the ice she thought was unbreakable. She didn't know what to say. How do you apologize for years of indifference? How do you explain to someone that you weren't cruel, just blind? As he walked away, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The need to make things right. To remember what humanity felt like before ambition devoured it. And in that moment, Evelyn Shaw, the woman who had everything, realized how little she truly had. All her victories, her accolades, her empire. None of it could undo the moment she'd once looked a desperate man in the eyes and said no. The coffee stain on her suit didn't bother her anymore. In fact, she left it there. Because every time she looked at it, she was reminded of a truth she had forgotten, that power means nothing without compassion. And somewhere behind the counter, the waiter glanced up once more, just long enough to see her looking, really looking, for the first time. Something in his chest loosened. He didn't know it yet, but that small crack in her heart was the beginning of everything that was about to change. The cafe had quieted down, but a strange heaviness lingered in the air, invisible, yet thick enough to feel. Evelyn sat at her corner table, untouched coffee growing cold beside her, the stain on her suit drying into a reminder she couldn't ignore. She had told herself she would leave after finishing her emails, but her fingers hovered uselessly over the keyboard. The numbers on the screen meant nothing now. All she could see was his face. Calm, quiet, unshaken, as if the world couldn't hurt him anymore. The waiter moved behind the counter, refilling cups, clearing tables, his routine steady and practiced. Every movement spoke of patience, discipline, and a strange serenity that only came from years of surviving storms. Evelyn watched him, and the longer she did, the more she realized something unexplainable. The room felt different around him. He didn't command attention with words or presence, but with silence. That same silence now echoed in her chest. She should have been angry. A man had spilled coffee on her. Deliberately or not, it was unprofessional, unacceptable. A younger version of her, the CEO who built empires, would have demanded his immediate firing. But today that version of her felt like a stranger, because when their eyes met, she had seen something no amount of success had ever given her: truth. Evelyn closed her laptop. For once, the world could wait. She needed to understand what had just happened, why her chest felt tight and her mind wouldn't quiet down. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe guilt, or maybe it was something deeper, something that had been buried for far too long. When he passed by her table again, she stopped him with a quiet, "Excuse me." He turned, polite but distant, as if expecting more scolding. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was calm, respectful, but there was a weight behind it, like every word had been measured before it left his lips. She looked up at him, unsure what to say at first. Her mind, usually so sharp and commanding, suddenly felt clumsy. About earlier, she began softly, "I overreacted, it's fine." "Really?" He smiled faintly, not out of comfort but understanding. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, bowing slightly before turning to leave. But something in his tone made her chest tighten again. It wasn't relief, it was resignation. "Wait," she said before she could stop herself. He paused, tray still in hand. "Have we met before?" He froze for just a second, but long enough for her to notice. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. "I don't think so, ma'am," he replied. But his eyes betrayed him. They carried the flicker of memory, the kind that doesn't fade, no matter how much time has passed. Evelyn felt her heart skip. There it was, that familiarity, that strange sense of deja vu that had been gnawing at her since the coffee spilled. She could feel it now. She had seen those eyes before, just not across a cafe counter. It was in that small, dim office years ago. That same quiet desperation, that same unspoken strength. He quickly turned away, busying himself with another table, but she couldn't let it go. Her mind was racing through fragments of the past. The pleading man, the medical file, the word "denied," stamped in red across the page, and a small girl's name written in the corner, Mia. The realization hit her like a wave. The folder had said, "For my daughter's future." He had been desperate, broken, trying to save his wife. And she had been the one who turned him away. She leaned back in her chair, her throat tightening. She wanted to say something, anything, but her voice wouldn't come. For a long moment, she just watched him work, the way he treated every customer with quiet kindness, even those who barely acknowledged his existence. How could he still be kind after everything? How could he not hate her? When he brought the bill to her table, their hands brushed briefly. She felt a shiver. "You're sure we've never met?" she asked again, softer this time, her tone almost pleading. He hesitated, then nodded. "I'm sure." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the lie. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "If you ever remember, please tell me," she whispered. It wasn't a command, but a confession. He gave a small nod, then stepped away. And as he did, something unspoken passed between them. An invisible current of truth neither was ready to face aloud. She sat there long after paying, watching him from afar. Each time he smiled at a customer, something inside her ached deeper. That kind of grace didn't come from ease, it came from survival. And suddenly, she realized that what she had seen in his eyes wasn't just pain. It was forgiveness. That realization broke her. Forgiveness, given freely, without being asked for, was heavier than guilt. It forced her to see herself stripped of title, power, pride. Just a woman who once failed another human being, and was now being silently absolved. When she finally rose to leave, she hesitated by the door. She turned to look at him one last time. He was standing by the counter, wiping a cup, lost in his own quiet world. The late sunlight streamed through the cafe window, wrapping him in a warm glow. For a fleeting second, he looked almost peaceful. And it struck her that maybe he'd made peace with the world long before she ever learned how. As she stepped outside, the wind felt different. Colder, sharper. She pulled her coat tighter, but no fabric could warm what had turned cold inside. For years, she had told herself she'd done what she had to, that the system was to blame, not her. But now, looking back at that cafe, she knew the truth. She had chosen indifference. And somewhere inside, the part of her that had once wanted to change the world whispered, it's not too late. She didn't know why, but she couldn't stop glancing back at the cafe door as she walked away. Something about that place, that man, had shifted the ground beneath her feet. She felt like a stranger in her own life now, unsure where she was heading, but certain of one thing she couldn't go back to, who she was before the spill, because one look into a waiter's eyes had reminded her of everything she'd lost. Her compassion, her purpose, her humanity. And for the first time in years, Evelyn Shaw, the unshakable CEO, felt the smallest spark of something she thought was gone forever. Remorse. And maybe, just maybe, redemption. The night after the incident refused to leave Evelyn alone. Even when she got home, to her immaculate penthouse high above the city, with its glass walls and million-dollar view, she couldn't shake off the weight sitting quietly on her chest. The city lights stretched endlessly below, blinking alive. Yet she had never felt so painfully aware of her own emptiness. She poured herself a glass of wine, but it didn't help. The reflection in the window wasn't the face of a confident CEO. It was the face of a woman who had finally been reminded of something she'd tried too hard to forget. That success without compassion is just loneliness in disguise. She tried to work, answering emails, signing off on proposals, but her hands trembled slightly. Every time she blinked, she saw his eyes again. Not accusing, not angry, just tired. Forgiving even. That was the part that haunted her most. He had every reason to hate her, but he didn't. It was as though his silence was teaching her a lesson words never could. The next morning she woke before dawn. No alarm, no schedule, just restlessness. Something inside her needed to see him again, though she didn't understand why. Maybe she wanted to apologize. Maybe she wanted to explain herself. Or maybe she just wanted to look at him one more time to convince herself he was real. By the time she walked into the cafe, the early crowd was still trickling in. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, comforting and nostalgic. She took the same seat as before, corner table, near the window. When he noticed her, he paused only for a second, a faint surprise flickering across his face, but then he nodded politely, as if she were any other customer. "Good morning, ma'am," he said softly. His tone was professional, kind, distant, the same as yesterday, and yet that calm distance now hurt more than open hostility ever could. "Good morning," she replied, her voice uncertain. He took her order, black coffee, no sugar, and disappeared behind the counter. She watched him move, steady and composed, like a man who'd made peace with life's cruelties long ago. And in that observation, she felt small again. How could someone who had suffered so much carry himself with such quiet dignity, while she, with all her power and privilege, carried only emptiness? When he brought her coffee, she tried to meet his eyes. "About yesterday," she began. He shook his head lightly. "You don't need to apologize again, ma'am. It happens." "No," she insisted, her voice softer now. "You don't understand. I wasn't angry about the coffee. I was surprised. You reminded me of someone." He looked at her then, really looked. For a moment, neither spoke. Words weren't needed. Truth hung between them like something fragile, waiting to be acknowledged. "I used to believe people in your position didn't notice faces like mine," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "And most of the time, I was right." She flinched, not because of the sharpness of his tone, but because of its honesty. "You're right," she said after a pause. "I didn't. Not then." He nodded slightly, accepting the confession, not using it against her. His calmness disarmed her again. It was strange how mercy could hurt more than blame. Evelyn stared into her cup. "I remember now," she whispered, almost to herself. "Your wife, she was sick. You came to my office." He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. "I told you there was nothing we could do." He looked away. "You were doing your job." The simplicity of his response shattered her. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I was doing what was easy." For a moment, the cafe around them vanished. No customers, no sound. Just two souls standing in the ruins of a past decision. Evelyn could feel the heat in her chest, the ache of regret spreading through every vein. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her words trembling. "Truly sorry. You deserved compassion, and He interrupted softly. "I forgave you a long time ago." Her breath caught. "Why?" He smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Because anger is a luxury people like me can't afford. My daughter needed peace, not bitterness. And so did I." Something in her cracked wide open. That quiet grace, that strength. It wasn't weakness. It was survival. It was what she had lost somewhere on her way to the top. "You're stronger than you know," she murmured. He gave a small shrug. "Maybe. Or maybe I just had no other choice." They both sat there for a moment, letting silence do the talking. Outside, the city began to wake. Buses roaring, people rushing, life moving as if nothing monumental was happening in that little cafe. But inside, something sacred was unfolding, the kind of understanding that doesn't need witnesses. Finally, Evelyn reached into her bag and placed a business card on the table. "I don't expect forgiveness to erase what happened," she said. "But if there's anything I can do for your daughter, please let me." He looked at the card but didn't take it. "You've already done something," he said gently. She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "You listened," he replied. "That's more than most people do." For a moment, her throat tightened with emotion. It had been years since anyone had made her feel this small and yet this human. She realized that no amount of money or status could repair what she'd broken. But humility could start the healing. When she stood to leave, he gave her a nod, the kind of nod shared between equals. No bitterness, no resentment, just quiet understanding. As she walked out into the morning sunlight, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years: relief. Not because the guilt had vanished, but because she had finally faced it. Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't arrive with words or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the eyes of the very person you once hurt. And as for him, he watched her go, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't planned any of this. The coffee, the encounter, the awakening. It had all just happened. Life's strange way of coming full circle. For Evelyn Shaw, it was the beginning of remembering her humanity. For the single dad, it was the quiet confirmation that kindness, no matter how bruised, still had power. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of that morning cafe, two broken lives had unknowingly started to heal. Not through revenge or pity, but through something rarer, something almost sacred. Forgiveness that didn't need to be asked for. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Her penthouse was silent, but her mind was loud. The city outside glittered like it always did, yet somehow the lights looked colder, emptier. She kept replaying his words over and over in her head. "Ah, you've already done something." You listened. Say. It was such a simple statement, yet it carried the weight of her entire life. For years, she had spoken in boardrooms, issued orders, given speeches. But when was the last time she had truly listened? She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring at the world she'd built. A world made of glass, power, and distance. For the first time, she could see the cracks in it. Her reflection stared back at her, not as Evelyn Shaw, the CEO, but as Evelyn Shaw, the woman who had once promised herself that she'd make a difference. Somewhere along the way, she'd traded meaning for numbers, empathy for efficiency, and people for profit. And now a single father with wary eyes had reminded her what humanity looked like. The next morning, she went back to the cafe. She told herself it was for coffee, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She needed to understand him. The calm, the forgiveness, the quiet dignity that didn't demand justice but offered grace instead. When she walked in, he looked up, surprised but not startled. He greeted her with that same gentle tone, like nothing between them was heavy or strange. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. She smiled faintly. "Evelyn," she corrected softly. "No more Mom." He hesitated for a second before nodding. "All right, Evelyn, what can I get you?" "Just coffee," she said, "and maybe a few minutes of your time." He chuckled quietly. "That'll cost extra." It was a small joke, but it made her laugh, genuinely laugh, for the first time in months. When he brought her cup over, she gestured for him to sit. He looked around, hesitated, then finally took the seat across from her. "I was thinking about what you said," she began, "about listening." He smiled faintly. "Most people think talking fixes things. It doesn't. Listening does." She nodded slowly. "You're right, and I haven't done that in a long time." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence gave her space to keep going. "I used to believe I was helping people," she said, staring into her cup. "But then the company grew, and everything became about numbers. Profit margins, investors' deadlines. The bigger it got, the less I saw the people behind those numbers. I stopped seeing stories. I only saw statistics." She exhaled deeply. "And one day I looked up and realized I didn't even recognize myself anymore." He listened quietly, his expression soft but unreadable. When she finally looked up, he said, "Sometimes we lose our way trying to survive." His words hit her like truth she'd been running from. "You've lost things too," she said quietly. He nodded. "My wife, my peace, but not my purpose." That line hung in the air, heavy and beautiful. "How do you hold on to that?" she asked. He looked down at his hands, rough, tired, but steady. "Because if I let go of it, then everything she went through, everything we went through, it would mean nothing. She made me promise to stay kind, no matter what. I didn't understand it back then. I thought kindness made you weak. But now I know it's the only strength worth having. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She could see Clara in her mind, though she'd never met her, through his words. A woman strong enough to teach her husband compassion even in her last days. That kind of love didn't die. It lived quietly inside the people it touched. He looked up, his gaze steady. "That's why I spilled the coffee," he said suddenly. Evelyn blinked, confused. "What?" He smiled faintly, but his eyes glistened. "It wasn't an accident. I did it on purpose." Her heart skipped. "Why?" she whispered. He leaned back, his tone soft but unwavering. "Because you needed to see me. Not as a waiter, not as a mistake, as a reminder. You see, sometimes life has to spill over for us to notice what's missing. I didn't do it to embarrass you or get revenge. I did it to wake you up." Evelyn's breath caught. His words settled in her chest like a slow, burning fire. "To wake me up," she repeated, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "When I saw you walk in, I didn't feel anger anymore. Just something unfinished. I thought maybe this was life's way of letting me close the loop. Not to hurt you, but to remind you of who you used to be. The woman who wanted to help." Her eyes blurred with tears. She hadn't cried in years. "You wanted to remind me of compassion." "No," he said gently. "I wanted to remind you that you still have it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe around them faded again, leaving only two souls and the weight of redemption between them. Evelyn couldn't stop the tears that slipped down her face. "I don't know how to make it right," she said, her voice trembling. "You already are," he said. "You're here. You're listening." She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it over his. It wasn't a business gesture. It was human. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, a small, tired, but real smile. "You don't have to thank me. Just don't forget again." "I won't," she promised. When she left that day, she didn't take her coffee. She didn't need it. Her heart was racing with something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about reports or meetings. She was thinking about people, about her company, about how many others like him had been turned away. And as she walked into the bright morning light, Evelyn Shaw made a silent vow that the world she built would finally start healing the very people it had once ignored. Inside the cafe, the single dad watched her go, a quiet peace settling over him. The circle was complete. The past had been seen, the pain acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, both of them had been set free. Sometimes destiny doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through spilled coffee, a small, imperfect act that ends up saving two souls who didn't even know they still needed saving. The next morning, the city woke up to a quiet shift that no one could see but Evelyn could feel. The air seemed lighter, clearer, as if something inside her had finally unclenched. She sat in her office, the skyline stretched out before her, yet it didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a mirror, reflecting the woman she used to be and the woman she was becoming. The echo of his words, "Faye, don't forget again," pulsed through her thoughts like a heartbeat. She opened her laptop and began scrolling through company files, project proposals, reports, names, numbers. But this time, she wasn't looking for profits. She was looking for stories. Behind every statistic, she began to see faces. Workers, assistants, janitors, waiters. People like him. People with battles no one noticed. The realization hit her hard. She had built an empire of progress that had forgotten its people. And that had to change. Evelyn didn't wait for a board meeting or a PR campaign. Change, she realized, wasn't born in announcements. It started in small, quiet revolutions. She called her assistant. "Get me HR and community relations," she said. "We're rethinking everything." By noon, Her entire leadership team was gathered around the long glass table, looking both curious and cautious. Evelyn stood at the head of the room, not with her usual commanding presence, but with something gentler, more human. "I know you're all wondering why I called this meeting," she began. "It's simple. I've been blind." The room shifted uneasily. Some exchanged glances, others stared straight ahead. Evelyn continued, her voice calm but firm. "We've become obsessed with performance metrics and quarterly growth. We've forgotten why we started this company in the first place, to create opportunities, to change lives. And lately, I've realized we stopped listening." Her CFO cleared his throat. "Evelyn, with all due respect, we've had a strong fiscal year. I'm not talking about numbers." She interrupted softly. "I'm talking about people." Silence fell. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. She could feel every eye on her, but she wasn't afraid anymore. "I met someone recently," she continued. "A man who reminded me that compassion isn't a weakness. It's the foundation of everything meaningful. We're going to start acting like it." One of the directors raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means," she said, pacing slowly, "we start supporting our employees in ways that matter. Better health care, mental health programs, scholarships for single parents, real opportunities for those who've been ignored." Her HR head frowned slightly. "That's a lot of financial restructuring, Evelyn." She turned to him, her expression unwavering. "Then restructure it, because I'd rather lose a few investors than lose our soul." The words landed with weight. For the first time, Evelyn wasn't giving orders. She was giving purpose, and they could feel it. One by one, heads began to nod. The energy in the room shifted, not instantly, but undeniably. A seed of change had been planted. After the meeting, Evelyn stepped out onto the balcony. The wind brushed her hair, and for a moment she closed her eyes. She could almost hear his voice again. Calm, grounded, unshakable. "Sometimes life has to spill over for us to notice what's missing." She smiled. "Message received," she whispered to the sky. But destiny wasn't quite done weaving their story. A week later, Evelyn returned to the cafe, a small envelope in her hand. He was behind the counter again, the same calm energy surrounding him. When he saw her, he smiled. "Back for another reminder," he teased gently. "Something like that," she said, sliding the envelope toward him. "This is for you." He frowned. "What is it?" "An opportunity," she said. "A job, not as a waiter, as a consultant for our new outreach program. I need someone who understands struggle, empathy, and resilience. Someone real." He blinked, caught off guard. "Evelyn, I can't accept this. I don't even have a degree." She smiled softly. "Good, then you're exactly what we need." For a moment, he just stared at her, his throat tightening. "Why me?" he finally whispered. "Because you reminded me what humanity looks like," she said. "And I want that to be part of what we build." His eyes glistened, but he smiled through it. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said gently. "But I owe the world something better than what I've given it." He took the envelope, hands trembling slightly. Inside was an offer letter, and something else as a small handwritten note. It read, "For Clara," because her kindness didn't die with her. His breath caught. He looked up and Evelyn saw the tears he tried to hide. "Thank you," he said, voice barely audible. "No," she replied, smiling through her own emotion. "Thank you for spilling the coffee." They both laughed. Soft, genuine laughter that carried the weight of everything they'd both endured. Around them, life continued. Cups clinking, people talking, sunlight pouring through the window. But something sacred had shifted. Two broken souls had found meaning not through perfection, but through accident, humility, and courage. As she left the cafe that day, Evelyn turned back one last time. He was wiping a table, humming softly, peace radiating from him like quiet light, and she realized something. He hadn't just changed her life. He'd reminded her how to live it. Weeks later, her company launched a new initiative called LUS, the Human Project. It provided jobs and education to single parents, veterans, and those rebuilding their lives after hardship. At the heart of it all was one guiding principle printed in bold on every brochure: LX. Sometimes, compassion begins with a single spill. The story of the CEO and the waiter spread quietly, not as gossip, but as inspiration. People talked about it in boardrooms, classrooms, and late-night cafes. Some said it was fate. Others said it was redemption. But for Evelyn and the single dad, it was something simpler. It was proof that kindness, once awakened, never truly dies. And somewhere, under the same golden light of that cafe, destiny smiled, because two souls had finally remembered what it means to be human. Months passed, and the cafe that had once been the stage for a spilled cup of coffee became something entirely different. A meeting point for change. Every few weeks, the same man who once stood behind the counter wiping tables now arrived there wearing a neatly pressed shirt, a notepad in hand, and that same calm presence that drew people in without a word. He wasn't serving coffee anymore. He was serving purpose. And every time he looked out the cafe window, he could see the reflection of his second chance looking back at him. Evelyn kept her promise. The Human Project had taken root faster than anyone expected. Within 3 months, dozens of people, single parents, laid-off workers, struggling students, had found opportunities through the program. Every morning, Evelyn made sure to read one story from the applications herself. She wanted to feel them, to remember that behind every name was a heartbeat. The old Evelyn, the CEO obsessed with growth and graphs, would have delegated that. But this Evelyn, the one who had been humbled by a spilled cup and a man's quiet strength, refused to forget what mattered. One late afternoon, as golden light spilled through her office windows, Evelyn received a letter. Handwritten. She smiled before she even opened it, recognizing the careful script. Dear Evelyn, Clara used to say that when you water a dying plant, you don't see the change right away. But one morning, the leaves just stop drooping, and the color comes back. That's what you did for me. You reminded me that pain doesn't have to end you. It can begin you again. Thank you for giving me a place where I can make a difference. Every day, I meet people who remind me of myself, tired, scared, but still fighting. And I tell them what you told me. You still have it. I thought you should know. The Human Project isn't just helping people. It's healing them. It's healing me. Sincerely, Daniel. Evelyn sat back, letting the words sink in. Healing. That word lingered, wrapping around her like warmth. She looked out the window, and for the first time in years, she realized she wasn't chasing success anymore. She was living it. Success wasn't the size of her empire. It was the number of lives her choices touched. But she wasn't done. That weekend, Evelyn visited one of the new training centers her company had opened. A place where single parents could learn new skills, supported with childcare and fair pay. The moment she stepped in, laughter filled the air. There were children playing in a corner, volunteers teaching soft-spoken adults how to code, and the smell of coffee, rich, familiar, grounding. Daniel was there, leading a small group. His sleeves were rolled up, his eyes focused as he helped a woman fix her resume. When he looked up and saw Evelyn, his smile spread easily, that same unshakable calm. Didn't expect the CEO to stop by, he teased. I don't expect to be called that anymore, she replied with a grin. I'm just Evelyn. He laughed. You sure about that? Because there's a line of people who might disagree. She looked around, her eyes landing on the people, the energy, the hope, and said softly, This is what I always dreamed of building. I just forgot what the dream looked like. Daniel nodded. You remembered in time. Most people don't. They walked together through the center, and Evelyn watched how Daniel interacted with everyone. The way he encouraged without preaching, how his presence softened people's fear. He had turned his pain into purpose, and in doing so, he had given others permission to do the same. At one point, a young woman with tired eyes approached Evelyn. She held a small notebook to her chest and whispered, "Thank you for this place. I was ready to give up, but now, I feel like I matter again." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She touched the woman's hand and said quietly, "You always mattered. You just needed someone to remind you." Later, when the room began to empty, Daniel and Evelyn sat by the window with 2 cups of coffee. This time, steady and unspilled. The sun dipped low, painting everything in amber. "You know," Daniel said, looking out at the fading light, "Clara used to believe everything happens twice. Once in life and once in memory. Maybe it's life's way of replaying something good." Evelyn smiled softly. Maybe she was right. She took a slow sip, her reflection rippling in the coffee's surface. "Do you ever think she'd be proud?" He nodded, eyes glistening. "Every day." There was a pause, not awkward but sacred. "You saved me too, Daniel," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "I didn't save anyone. You saved yourself." She shook her head. "No. You reminded me to listen. You reminded me that hearts don't speak in boardrooms. They speak in moments like this." He smiled, eyes soft. "Maybe we just helped each other remember." Outside, the world moved on. Cars passing, people rushing, life continuing. But inside that cafe, 2 people sat side by side, bound by something deeper than gratitude. It was understanding, the kind that only comes from pain, loss, and rediscovery. Before leaving, Evelyn looked around one last time. "You ever think it's strange?" she asked. "How one small mistake, 1 cup of spilled coffee, could lead to all this?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the thing about life. The messiest moments are often the ones that make the most sense later." She laughed softly. "You should write that down." "Maybe one day," he said, smiling. "But for now, I think I'll just live it." The Evelyn nodded, watching him gather his notes as the cafe lights flickered on. The world outside glowed with evening warmth, and for the first time she felt peace. Not the fragile kind that needed quiet, but the kind that came from knowing she was finally aligned with something true. As she stepped out into the fading day, she thought of Clara, of Daniel, of all the people who had been touched by that one act of imperfection. She smiled to herself and whispered, "Sometimes the spill isn't a mistake, it's the message." Behind her, Daniel looked out through the cafe window, watching her disappear into the sunset. He didn't chase her. He didn't need to. They both knew. Their story wasn't about endings. It was about beginnings born from brokenness. And in that golden hour, with coffee cups cooling on the table and laughter echoing from the training room behind him, Daniel realized something beautiful. Healing doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes quietly, like forgiveness poured back into an empty cup, ready to be filled again. Weeks turned into months, and the human project began to ripple beyond Evelyn's company walls. What started as a quiet initiative born from a moment of spilled coffee had become a movement. One that reached other corporations, schools, and even communities that had long forgotten the warmth of compassion. But while the world around them was transforming, inside both Evelyn and Daniel, something deeper was happening, something unspoken but profound. They had become unlikely friends, a CEO and a former waiter, bound not by circumstance, but by understanding. Every Friday, without fail, they met at the same cafe where it all began. They didn't plan it. It just happened. She'd always sit at the same corner table, the one near the window, and he'd walk in with that familiar calmness that seemed to quiet everything around him. They would talk about work, life, loss, and sometimes about nothing at all. But each conversation added another thread to a tapestry they didn't even know they were weaving. That evening, the cafe buzzed softly with the hum of conversation and jazz music drifting in the background. Rain tapped gently against the glass, turning the city into a watercolor painting. Evelyn looked up as Daniel walked in, shaking droplets off his jacket. "You're late," she teased, smiling. "Traffic," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "The city's alive tonight." She laughed. "It always is. We just never used to notice." He nodded, glancing outside. "Funny how we rush through life and miss the small things. Like rain. Or people," she added quietly. He looked at her, and for a moment, their eyes met with that familiar knowing. The kind of connection that didn't need words. She changed the subject gently. "So, how's the training center doing?" He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Better than I ever imagined. We just placed our 100th trainee in a full-time job last week." Her face lit up. "That's incredible." "It's them," he said humbly. "They're doing the hard part. I just help them believe they can." Evelyn smiled. "And that's the hardest part of all." There was a pause. The comfortable kind that happens between people who no longer need to fill silence. The rain grew heavier outside, streaking down the windows. Evelyn wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Do you ever think about Clara?" she asked softly. Daniel's expression softened. "Every day," he admitted. "But it doesn't hurt like it used to. It's quieter now. I think she's proud of what's come from all of this." "She would be," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "You've turned pain into something beautiful." He smiled faintly. "So have you." She looked away, her gaze lost in the rhythm of the rain. "Maybe, but some nights I still wonder why it took so long, why I had to lose myself before I found meaning again." He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Because sometimes we don't grow until life breaks the ground beneath us. You can't plant new roots in untouched soil." Her eyes glistened. "You always know exactly what to say." He chuckled softly. "I don't. I just know what it feels like to be lost." Lightning flickered in the distance, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to slow down. Evelyn thought about all the choices, the chaos, the years she'd spent climbing ladders that leaned against the wrong walls. And sitting across from her was the man who had, without even trying, brought her back down to the ground, where real life was happening. "Daniel," she said quietly, "do you ever think that maybe we were meant to meet?" He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes warm and searching. "I don't think it was an accident," he said finally. "Life has a strange way of putting the right people in our path, even if it has to spill a little coffee to do it." She laughed through a tear. "You and your coffee metaphors. They work," he said, grinning. She shook her head, smiling. "They do." The rain slowed, fading into a soft drizzle. People began packing up, leaving the cafe one by one. But neither of them moved. The world outside was busy, loud, endless. Yet in that small corner, time stood still. After a while, Daniel spoke again, his tone more serious this time. "Evelyn, I've been offered something." She looked up. "Offered?" He nodded. "A position in another city. A chance to expand the project. To build something similar there." Her smile faltered. "That's amazing," she said carefully, though her heart sank a little. "It is," he agreed. "But it means leaving here. Leaving this." The words hung between them. Fragile, uncertain. Evelyn stared at her cup, her thoughts racing. She wanted to tell him not to go, that the project needed him here, that she needed him here. But she stopped herself. This wasn't about her. It never had been. She took a deep breath. Then you have to do it, she said finally, forcing a smile. You've always said kindness shouldn't stay in one place. It should spread. He studied her face for a long time. You really think I should? I do, she said softly. And besides, you won't be gone. Everything you've built, everything we've built, will still carry your heart in it. He smiled, eyes heavy with emotion. You always find the right words too, you know. She laughed quietly, blinking back tears. I learned from the best. They stayed until closing, neither wanting to say goodbye. When they finally stood, he reached for his coat, hesitated, and looked at her one last time. You changed my life, Evelyn. She shook her head gently. No, you just reminded me how to live mine. He smiled. That same peaceful, grounded smile she had first seen on the day everything went wrong and somehow turned right. Take care of them, he said. I will, she whispered. As he stepped out into the soft drizzle, Evelyn watched through the glass as he disappeared down the glowing street. It wasn't sadness she felt. It was gratitude. Some people enter your life to stay, others enter to awaken something you'll carry forever. When she turned back, the waiter approached to clear the table. Another cup of coffee, ma'am, he asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. No, thank you. I've had enough. But as she walked out into the rain, she whispered under her breath, and I'll never forget the first one. That night, the city lights reflected in puddles like scattered stars, and somewhere far down the road, Daniel looked up at the same sky, feeling the same quiet peace. The world kept moving, but something sacred had settled between them. The understanding that even goodbyes can be beginnings when the lesson has been learned. Because some stories don't end when people part ways. They live on, in the projects they build, the lives they touch, and the hearts they heal. And as the rain washed the streets clean, the story of the single dad and the CEO became more than memory, it became legacy. Years later, the cafe still stood, brighter, busier, but with the same warm hum that once carried the sound of a cup tipping and a destiny unfolding. A new barista served customers behind the counter, unaware that the framed photo near the register, a smiling woman and a man holding mugs of coffee, marked where a story of compassion began. Evelyn often visited quietly, sitting by the window, watching life move as Daniel's program continued to change countless lives across cities. Sometimes she'd hear someone mention the human project and smile, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She'd lift her cup and whisper, "Here's to you, Daniel." Somewhere out there, maybe miles away, he'd be doing the same. Two souls still connected by kindness. Their lives had moved on, but the message remained one small act, born of pain and courage, could ripple through the world like light through glass. And though time moved forward, their story never truly ended. It simply kept pouring, like coffee refilled endlessly, warming every heart it touched.